did we go from this to this? It is clear that men's fashion, like women's fashion, has changed drastically throughout the centuries. However, only women's fashion has been able to sustain waves of eccentric dressing and a loose grip on what's in fashion. If you look at celebrity fashion for men, especially from big events from the last 2 decades, you'll see there seems to be almost no change aside from a couple twists of, ooh, that's different. So how, but more importantly, why did men's fashion become what it is now? Let's get into it. But first, mini disclaimer alert, I'm not a man. Obviously. So most of my information in this video is based on fashion history and research. I can't claim to know what's going on in the heads of men collectively, but I can draw some conclusions from research-based evidence. And as usual, you'll find my sources in the description. Let's start with history, because in order for us to know why fashion looks the way it does presently, we must look at how it was transformed throughout time. A summary of men's fashion history. Now, I could try my best to summarize fashion history on a global scale all the way from ancient Greece, Rome, and Egypt, but trust me, that would probably turn into a 3-part video essay. So instead, I'm going to summarize men's fashion as briefly as possible. And also, if you want more detailed summaries of fashion throughout the centuries, I did find this helpful website created by the Fashion Institute of Technology, so feel free to check it out if you want to read more about any specific decade. During the Middle Ages, fashion was highly influenced by institutions, as in the church and the monarchy. What was considered as acceptable was dictated by these institutions, which is one of the reasons fashion didn't change drastically over the years. Fashion remained a privilege only for the few, as its main purpose was to symbolize wealth and class status. As for common folk, well, they wore the same rags all the time, so let's be real, fashion wasn't exactly exquisite back then unless you were wealthy. According to Fit's website, the vast majority of men wore woolen tunics and capes from the previous centuries over plain linen shirts and drawers. The wealthier men decked themselves in ornaments and luxurious fabrics, while the lower classes could only afford certain dyed colors and styles. While this era had a distinct separation between women's and menswear, it was overall, as we'd like to perceive in this age, over the top. And that's because it was meant to be inaccessible for common folk. In the Middle Ages, fashion turned away from extravagant attire partly due to its impracticality on the battlefield. Men's fashion toned down drastically, though the tunic format of dressing remained and more color was added. In the Renaissance period, fashion remained in the control of the monarchy, with monarchs like Henry VIII setting examples for menswear. This monarch-led fashion, though changing in shapes, sizes, and colors, lasted throughout the Elizabethan era, Jacobean era, etc. It's only in the 1660s that new menswear styles were introduced. They were paving the way for the coat, waistcoat, and knee breeches styles we know so well from period movies. Skipping through the mid-18th century, the Rococo influence was at its peak, and menswear continued to slim down in both size and lavishness. It's in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution when fashion took a drastic turn for the simpler, with the French Revolution having brought about new fashions. The new in-fashion model was neoclassicism, with both women's and menswear taking inspiration from classical antiquity. In this new world came about the beloved empire waist dresses for women, and menswear focused its spotlight on new British fashion. Many of us may be familiar with these styles as they're prominent in Jane Austen's books, and especially menswear to this day still has some elements from this era. Menswear continued to shift slightly with the rise of romanticism in the 1820s due to the harsh realities that came with the Industrial Revolution. Colors and exaggerated silhouettes had a comeback, and by the 1850s, sewing machines were used for ready-to-wear clothing. Menswear continued to evolve towards more relaxing fit, focusing on clothing that was comfortable and less restricting. The Roaring Twenties, aka the 1920s, were an age of glitz and glamour, with women's attire shortening in length and shifting towards a more androgynous silhouette, and men's fashion progressing onward towards simplicity and a fun, comfy fit. The 1940s and 50s, though, is when men's fashion took a big turn with the presence of World War II progressing fashion to an even simpler format. Sporty, casual looks paved the way for working-class men, while women's fashion steered its way back to feminine and formal silhouettes. Fast forward to the 90s, yeah, it's a totally different world. Casual attire reached its peak with the closing of the 20th century, and grunge fashion took over the red carpet appearances. Hip-hop took over the streets and is thriving to this day, as we can see from the latest NFL halftime show. By the way, if you want more detailed accounts of the attire from these decades, a lot of my sources provide great information I couldn't dive into because it would have made this video 3 times as long. Men's fashion in the present day. It's interesting how men's fashion to this day hasn't changed that drastically from the 90s, and we still find the same looks on the red carpet we found back then, with maybe a little bit of extra ornamentation and bling added to the mix. While there are fluctuations of changes in men's fashion, usually due to the influence of celebrities like musicians, actors, or even sports players, these styles never seem to stick with the mainstream men's fashion. Whenever a man dresses in glitz and glamour, questions about their sexuality or personality arise in usually less than ideal wording, wrapped comfortably in the toxic masculinity which men continue to use to pressure and control each other with. Alan Flusser, Ben Barry, and other theorists have pondered on the gradual shift in men's dress. In his essay, Clothes and the Man, The Principles of Fine Men's Dress, Flusser takes notes of the shifts in values for men when using fashion to establish their identities. Up until the 18th century, it was often the man who dressed more flamboyantly than the woman, his wardrobe filled with laces and bows as well as high-heeled shoes with shiny buckles. However, as the country changed, so did clothing styles. With the emphasis on democracy and the glorification of the common man, clothing became less ornate, less ostentatious. Today, when a man is dressed in feminine attire, it's revolutionary. But back in the old medieval days, those red heels and puff-sleeve tops were peak men's fashion. Between mass manufacturing, an increasing pressure of gender divide, and the craving for increased simplicity, men's fashion has, in my opinion, both declined and evolved. There's no way working-class men of today would even attempt to wear extravagant outfits because that extravagance does not represent wealth or power anymore. No, what's power is walking into a cocktail bar with the most plain outfit on, but if you look at the brand tag, everyone can tell you spent a fortune on that outfit. The price tag triumphs over the visual aesthetics of a man's outfit. After all, these days men who aren't part of nobility have power and wealth. And most of those men, as we can all see, are far from fashion forward. They don't need fashion to tell people they're different. The internet will tell you exactly who they are without them ever having to showcase their wealth in their fashion choices. I think Aspers and Godart, in their essay Sociology of Fashion, Order and Change, sum up well what the display of wealth looks like back then versus now. The feminine and masculine sides of the fashion industry are clearly delimited, with different creative and productive processes such as different fashion shows. Today, the feminine side clearly prevails. Historically, this has not always been the case. For example, in the 18th century Europe, men's fashion was at least as extravagant and significant as women's fashion. In Europe, the 19th century saw the emergence of a sober and simpler dress for men. This is because, as first theorized by Goblet, in European bourgeois families, men had to show their focus on work through understated clothes but simultaneously had to display their wealth throughout the adornment of their wives. Today, gender boundaries are not as clearly defined, even though they are still prevalent all over the world. As history progressed after World War II and during the Industrial Revolution, the fashion industry required the help of the middle-class man in order to sustain itself. The commodification of clothing was a necessary step in acquiring the common folk to participate in fashion, and thus fashion that would be marketed and sold exclusively for men was born. Flusser wrote in detail about the many changes in American dress after the war, such as the gradual introduction of the sack suit, which was very different from its European predecessors. It is no accident that men's fashion had to continue to drastically differentiate itself from women's fashion, mostly in the format of increasing simpler dress, because after all, it had to be turned into something entertaining and self-bettering for men. Something that doesn't require the average Joe to think too hard about what to wear, but to be just insecure enough about their dress so that they continue to shop for clothing. In his essay Refashioning Masculinity, Ben Barry talks about John Flugel's analysis on the Great Masculine Renunciation, which is the historical phenomenon at the end of the 18th century in which wealthy Western men stopped using bright colors, elaborate shapes, and variety in their dress, which were left to women's clothing. Instead, their focus turned to minor differences in the cut and quality of their clothes. Barry notes how ultimately modern men's dress norms have been defined by what styles to avoid and repress, rather than what to strive for or be inspired by. What's important to understand through fashion history is that there has been a shift of emphasis from the collective to the individual. Fashion isn't dictated by any institution or great force of nature, but rather it changes consistently with new waves of inspiration and is styled by the individual. We've seen this increasingly throughout the last few decades, but now more than ever, personal style is thriving and widely accepted in most places. I do believe, however, that men's fashion to this day has a stricter leash on what's acceptable and what's not compared to women's fashion. It seems that even throughout fashion history, it was women's fashion that was ever changing, whereas men's fashion had slower periods of change. But what we can note throughout all of these different fashion eras is that men's fashion continued to become simpler and simpler in format. We'll return to personal style in just a second, but let's look at how gender roles and sexuality play a part in all of this. the link between men's fashion, gender roles, and sexuality. I won't get into the deep psychology behind gender roles and norms, but we must have a common understanding of them in order to notice how they dictate men's choices on dress. Let's start with the obvious: men are providers, women are nurturers. This notion has been largely debated and is still prevalent in the 21st century, with patriarchal systems still having control of most countries across the globe. With this notion comes strict rules around men's behavior, treatment, and dress. Eventually, the idea that a wealthy man would portray their wealth with luxurious clothing got completely flipped on its head when dressing well was fully integrated into middle-class society. Dressing poorly had now become an option only for the ultra-wealthy or the extremely poor. In his essay, Refashioning Men, Fashion, Masculinity, and the Cultivation of the Male Consumer in Britain 1860 to 1914, Brent Shannon discusses the 19th century writings surrounding fashion. Pope and Bradley's 1912 clothing catalog, for example, empathically asserted, "It savors very much of cant and hypocrisy for any man to say that he does not study dress in one form or another. It is absolutely imperative for a man nowadays to study his appearance. As a business, a professional, or a social asset, it is a very potent factor, and it is the privilege only of the millionaire and the pauper to be able to dress badly." Having an interest in fashion has been considered an activity mostly for women for the past couple centuries. Shannon discussed in detail about the way in which marketing forces have had to work hard to convince the middle-class man to have interest in fashion without feeling like it demasculinizes or emasculates them. The iconography of shopping, its spaces, its goods, as well as the very act of shopping itself, are consistently encoded as feminine. Consumption is readily linked to adornment and beautification of the body, and therefore has been historically associated with the feminine and female vanity. Men are believed to exhibit very little interest in ornamentation or style, dressing instead for comfort and utility. In her essay, The Modernization of Fashion, Anne Hollander supports this claim by stating, "It is more ever true that male fashion hadn't budged much in a century, and people had the vague idea that it never had as much importance as feminine display. Despite the emancipation of women, the view was still held that civilized men naturally dressed plainly, as if for unself-conscious action, but women dressed fancifully for deliberate allure." In the early 2000s, a man with a strong interest in fashion could easily receive hate speech. This hate speech was often targeted at their potential sexual orientation. "That's gay" has been often used in a toxic setting to restrict, control, and shame men who walk too close to the sun that is fashion and femininity. Even in our modern day, we still manage to find it shocking when a man puts on a dress to a gala event or photo shoot, and questions surrounding their reason for wearing a dress always arise. Men cannot wear fashion items that are considered feminine without potentially facing harsh criticism from society. The thing is, this exact push and pull action of experimentation with fashion has been happening to men for a long time. Shannon took note of how this behavior was exhibited back in the day. Certainly, antagonism towards effeminate behavior accelerated during an age in which rugged masculinity and athleticism were enthusiastically celebrated by popular culture. Any man who seemed to care too much about his appearance risked accusations that he was weak and womanish. Direct associations between effeminacy and homosexuality, however, did not emerge until Oscar Wilde's gross indecency conviction in 1895. The highly publicized trials irrevocably outed underground Victorian homosexuality, linked aestheticism to deviant male sexuality, and rendered any evidence of effeminate dandyism and sartorial excess immediately suspicious. This trial didn't really affect men's fashion consumption, but rather how there was a limit to how fashionable one could look without having their sexuality questioned. If we compare it to modern-day examples, it's still a prevalent stereotype that a well-dressed man is either gay or European, or both. And heck, there's even a song about it in the Legally Blonde musical. Shannon continues his thought about the concept of conforming. He notes how 19th century British conduct writers such as J. Hogg, the writer of The Glass Fashion, often cautioned their readers to conform to popularly accepted conventions, and how failing to do so would risk social stigma. These writers would repeatedly urge their readers to prioritize keeping up with popular trends and adhering to acceptable men's fashion so as to avoid a humiliating sartorial faux pas. By the way, I highly recommend reading both Shannon's and Brent's essays if you want to look into the details of how men's fashion was perceived by society in the 18th and 19th centuries. I personally found it very interesting and have been struggling to not include their entire essays in this video. Anyways, it's no secret that it's often assumed that gay men are more fashionable than heterosexual men. With gender norms being pushed onto people from every direction, it makes sense that the LGBTQ community has and will continue to rebel against these norms via every tool available, including fashion. Fashion is used to define and shape gender as well as gender identities, and in the case of men, dress is used to form a certain image of masculinity. However, like with femininity, there are many forms and hybrids of presented masculinities. Barry talks in detail about these hybrids of masculinity and how they perform in different social settings, and most notably, how men use dress to secure social domination and thus consequently support an unequal gender system. According to Barry, men create these hybrid masculinities as an act of self-preservation in different social spaces. Multiple masculinities result from men's various social identities. Masculinities are marginalized by race or class and subordinated by sexuality. These multiple masculinities comprise configurations that are both fluid and conflicted. The ways in which men do masculinity by dressing their bodies are flexible because men may choose their own clothes, yet their decisions are heavily constrained by the gender norms and the system of accountability and control of their context. As Barry states, men combine bits and pieces of different gender performances into their own performance of masculinity. Some would argue that these hybrid masculinities lead to the decline of the patriarchal system and heterosexism in specific contexts. And while I don't disagree it's possible, I think it's about time we created a distance from toxic and outdated patriarchal values. I think this experimental bits and pieces dressing is especially prominent in our modern era, where, though still met with limitations, men's fashion allows for more experimentation. You can see this even in sports, such as the latest NFL Super Bowl game where players arrived in colorful fitted suits and shiny sets. I recently made a video on Eagles players' pregame outfits, by the way, which I think you will find interesting if you want to see how modern men's fashion is performed in major sports settings. Barry also notes that gay and black cultures, though celebrating their identities via the use of flamboyant fashion, also tend to avoid showcasing these styles outside of their communities to avoid discrimination. It seems that men, especially black and gay men, seem to hesitate to wear their more feminine styles outside of their safety zones. This is why it makes sense that places like New York City that are fashion hotspots are also considered as safe spaces for men who wish to express their style in a more feminine or alternative manner. Like I said, we could dive into all the details on these topics, but I recommend reading the works I mentioned if you want to read more. I also low-key want to read more. I've been really struggling making this video because I keep finding more information and more fun stuff to add, and then I realize, hey, this is a 3-hour video at this point, so yeah, you have no idea how much stuff I had to leave out of this video. The significance of subcultures and race. Speaking of hip-hop entering the realm of fashion, let's talk about the significance of subcultures in fashion. We had the rise of punk and goth subcultures in the 1970s, grunge in the 80s, hip-hop in the 90s, emo in the early 2000s, and so on and so forth. These days, while subcultures are alive and well, they have been partially replaced by aesthetics in the fashion communities, though I'll doubt they'll ever disappear due to their inherent nature of creating communities. I've talked about this more in depth in my personal style videos, but subcultures play a significant role in helping us categorize ourselves into a visual identity based on our values, interests, and even lifestyles. Subcultures also harvest community and bridge the gap between fashion and other forms of art, politics, etc. They create spaces for like-minded people who represent themselves visually similarly to one another. This similarly visual dressing is done to signify their belonging in the subculture and what that means for their self-representation, values, and such. I want to use a well-known subculture as an example for this next bit, so let's talk about hip-hop. In the case of hip-hop, aside from hip-hop dancing at a younger age, I personally cannot relate to it as a fashion choice, but I do respect its core values and history. In his essay, Spatial Rapping, A Speculation on Men's Hip-Hop Fashion, Scott L. Ruff examines the history and the cultural and racial significance of hip-hop. Ruff states, hip-hop is an identity statement that simultaneously articulates a resistance to a deep-seated mental colonization and a utopian reimagining of the possibilities of resistant identities. Many find hip-hop's appeal in the fact that it symbolizes resistance. Even those who are not part of an African diasporic experience can inhabit through hip-hop fashion the many characteristics that dominant white culture attributes to Black resistance, including hypermasculinity, gangstaness, danger, mystique, urbanity, physicality, and street credibility. One can, in other words, wear the skin of resistance without paying the price. In many cases of fashion, while fashion recycles through decades, it also often borrows from other cultures, and in the worst cases, appropriates cultural attire or tries to put a spin on it. I think hip-hop is one of those that borders between a subculture and appropriation depending on the context, such as whether it's accompanied by an artistic endeavor or if it's trying to embody this earlier mentioned gangsta look. Rough notes that hip-hop music, dance, and possibly attire are all linked to West African and African diasporic traditions. The erasure of history through slavery, Western colonization of the African continent, and cultural genocide have left the Black diasporic identity with vast silences and unreadable historical gaps. Hip-hop clothing speaks a formal language that attempts to bridge some of those gaps and silences by means of a patchwork process that operates across discrepant historical spaces. It's well known that white people love to steal designs and styles from other cultures and appropriate them, and that what may be considered as ugly or improper suddenly becomes glam or cool when a white person wears it. But while this is a topic for another time, since it is more heavily related to women's fashion, we do see this attempt to copy in men's fashion as well. What I want us to focus on though is that cultures, subcultures, and race play a huge role in our fashion identities. Hip-hop fashion's values are rooted not only in the concept of resistance, but also in African American culture and values. Instead of every man trying to identify with their social class or aspiring class, men who have an interest in fashion or visual self-representation have shifted to using fashion not only as a visual representation of their identity, but also of their background and/or culture. While to many this may look ugly or lazy in comparison to what the monarchs or the gentlemen used to wear back in the day, personally, I find it beautiful and inspiring that fashion can be used purposefully to convey one's own values, culture, and interest. And finally, of course, fashion looks very different across the globe. I actually made a whole chapter on this, but realized that my take is way too subjective, so I can't realistically comment on much else than, hey, fashion is perceived differently depending on where you live. Oh, and by the way, if you don't know who I am, my name is Yemi and I make all sorts of fashion content, so if you like what you're seeing, make sure to like and subscribe so you can see more content like this and support my channel. Thank you very much. Okay, promo time over. The personalization of fashion. Now let's quickly circle back to how the personalization of fashion impacts men's fashion on a wider scale. With social media taking over the fashion industry since the 2010s, fashion has never been more personal yet mass-produced. Everything is original yet a copy of something old. The strictness around specific attire being considered appropriate in certain social circles has slowly dissipated over time to its most popular formats: formal, events, smart casual, and casual attire. The shame in dressing differently is not nearly as prevalent as it was even just a century ago, but at the same time there are hardly any good set examples for most men to follow. Back in the day, you didn't learn what good style was through social media fashion gurus, articles, or asking your friends. Your dad would buy you that good old set of suits for every occasion you needed. Fashion was, due to its constricted nature, provided to you automatically. You couldn't look out of style if you wore what everyone else did. But here's the thing, while the standards for fashion have changed over time, so have the social classes. We didn't see anyone but the monarchs wear their extravagant gowns and capes. Nope, they were a pure status symbol, and if you really wanted to compare it to our current era, you could compare it to the ownership of the Air Jordan 13 bread, which apparently go for as much as $2.2 million. In many ways, fashion has always been a status symbol of wealth and the division of social classes, and it has merely shaped itself from fancy capes to, well, sneakers that look like I could thrift them at a Goodwill. The ownership of certain fashion collectibles serves merely to make the collector appear wealthy. Like Balenciaga tries every time, you can sell tape, plastic bags, and trash and call it fashion as long as the price tag is high enough. In her essay, Drop Culture, Masculinity, Fashion Performance, and Collecting in Hypebeast Brand Communities, Elizabeth Affuso talks about the emergence of Hypebeast culture, which actually connects to the need for exclusivity and display of wealth with the need to belong into a certain subculture. Hypebeasts are quite literally beasts for the hype, and the subculture is rendered around a system of product drops. Hype is generated when limited edition merchandise is released as an event, creating physical community spaces at stores and online communities centered on sharing product knowledge, collecting, and reselling. What started as an innocent online sneaker culture website turned into a tool for digital marketing, requiring the participants of Hypebeast culture to possess wealth in order to acquire status. This phenomenon uses digital marketing to promote the rise of conspicuous consumption, in which the youth are hyped up to consume high-end brands and luxury goods in order to feel included and increase their social status. Status in the Hypebeast communities requires both the funds to acquire goods and the leisure time to support the temporal demands of waiting in line for product drops. So how is this related to personal style? Well, in our current times, there are many debates concerning the personal style to influencer pipeline. Anyone with knowledge or good style in a certain niche can turn the attention they've garnered into profit, which in turn brings into question the authenticity of their style. I've talked about this in great deal in my The Immortality of Personal Style video, but ultimately, style can in certain ways be used for profit. What this means is that while men of the modern era have free will, the lie of wealth being easily achievable for a regular guy has never been more believable. Affuso describes perfectly how fashion easily becomes an online tool for clout, rather than a personalized style with real purpose. Digital culture has produced a context collapse. People are wearing outfits not necessarily for their lived environment, but for their digital audiences. Additionally, digital culture has reorganized style icons away from models, celebrities, and designers toward influencers. So what this means for your average guy is that he's left to his own devices on how to find his personal style. But he's also being sold a promise of benefits like money, fame, and, for those who want it, women. All of that in the name of fashion. So yeah, go wear your baggy jeans, but remember boys, dressing to impress will get you a firm handshake from your boss. Where's my pause? In some ways, men's fashion ideologies haven't changed much at all. So to sum it up, I do think that personalization of fashion has brought some spark back into men's fashion, but this personalization is not very commonly accepted nor encouraged in most social circles like finance bros, etc. Personal style is to deviate from the norm. And if there's anything that I've learned through my years of observing masculine fashion, it's that different equals bad. This individuality is more encouraged among women than men because, as you guessed it, gender norms and expectations. Marketing for men and the taboo of artistic pursuit. If it wasn't already clear from, well, us being alive and having watched ads since we were kids, men are marketed to very differently from women. While I would love to dive into this from a historical perspective from Shannon's article, I'm going to merely summarize, because once again, it would be its own essay. As we know, the middle-class men were necessary in the advancement of fashion after there was a common realization that your regular old monarch wasn't dressing to impress anymore. As Shannon states, marketers did their best to make fashion safe for men so that they could shop without violating existing taboos and norms of masculinity. The consumption of goods and the investment in fashion had to be turned into something appropriate for the masculine man. In many ways, this is still the case in our modern day, with men's and women's clothing being separated by entire floors in stores like Zara and H&M. Fashion has to not only look different for men, but fashion spaces for men must also keep a masculine air about them. But the most important thing that Shannon points out is that, above all, men's fashion has to be different from women's in every possible way. For example, back in the 18th century, the need for men's masculinity to be constantly affirmed in mostly women-populated spaces like department stores led to aggressive marketing targeted at men, which led to the creation of spaces that emulated the appearance and atmosphere of the gentleman's club. Men also had general incentive to go into these spaces since many of the employees and customers were women. This made department stores the perfect playground for flirting and courting. As Shannon states, by the 1980s and 1990s, male products were advertised through the lens of male sexuality. It was the display of the body through the product used or worn that was sexy. I've already covered the topic of the male ideal body in fashion through my ideal body type analysis video, but to sum it up, just like women are advertised products and clothing through skinny but curvy, young but sultry models, men are advertised products through muscular yet lean male models. I believe there's a slight difference in how men and women view fashion, as is apparent from what I've been saying thus far. I do, however, think that one of the biggest differences is that men do not, or rather are not allowed to, consider fashion as an artistic pursuit. Instead, they can use it as a tool to control how others perceive them. Yeah, that's my masculine man right there behind me. Perhaps this is why we always return back to the classic suit. because it represents something strong and you cannot judge a man as easily if he's wearing a suit. Perhaps this means men's fashion is but a means for social class aspiration or representation. Then again, I believe this definitely applies to women as well. It's natural for all of us to want to be perceived in a specific way, usually in a socially acceptable way. But I do think there is more wiggle room in women's fashion when it comes to viewing fashion as something artistic or as something connected to us on a fundamentally deeper level. Unfortunately, I don't really have any definitive answers and can only go based off of conversations that I've had with men, history, and sociology. But maybe I'm going somewhere with this. If you want to delve deeper into this, Hollander discusses these topics from a societal perspective in her essay. Oh, that's a good bean stretch. So yeah, go give that essay a read. Conclusion. Now that we've looked at the history, evolution, and the current meaning and function of men's fashion, I think it's safe to say that while it has on a larger scale become more boring, it also has a lot more to offer in terms of personalization. Perhaps my thumbnail and title may have fooled you to assume that my perception of it being boring was set in stone. So apologies for misleading you to get you here. Because wealth and power are not indicated as strongly through extravagant and luxurious fashion, even our current day monarchs have for the most part toned down their display of wealth. With the forced differentiation and drastic separation of feminine versus masculine fashion, makeup, skincare, etc., your average Joe won't in most cases be trying to emulate fashion that could in our modern day be misunderstood as flashy or feminine leaning. Even if the man's skincare package is made of the same exact ingredients as the women's, it has to be wrapped in masculine branding. Men's fashion of today, while reaching new heights in experimentation, does overall have a tight leash on its consumers in order to never slip back into feminine pieces and silhouettes. The black tie suit will continue to remain in a golden standard as long as strong, basic masculinity is considered to be the cornerstone of men's fashion. I don't know about you, but this research definitely gave me a newfound appreciation into men's fashion alternatives and subcultures. Whether you're trying to identify as a Brooklyn boy or a punk artist, at least you're closer to expressing a truer aspect of yourself than you would be in ye olden days. Anyways, what do you guys think of men's fashion? Let me know in the comments, I'm really excited to hear. And with that, thank you for watching, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.